Cato's mind buzzed with possibilities as he stumbled out of the chantry and into the sunlight. The flesh of his mended calf was seared where the hand of the healer had touched it, and his reknitted bones ached in protest as he put weight on them. None of that mattered to him. He had found the key, the missing piece. He silently repeated the words of the chant, making certain he fixed them into his memory. He could hear the sound of flowing water from behind the building as he stepped through the white stone doorway and into the morning sunlight. A strong wind blew across the portico, but it did little to make the damp heat of the island more bearable. The breeze continued up a dirt path where it whipped back the crimson cape of an approaching prison guard. Half-grown stalks of wheat rippled in the field behind him. Cato took a few steps off the portico, moving slowly enough not to alarm the approaching guard. When he reached a fair vantage point, he turned back to look up at the white stone building. 3 stories high and formed of intricately shaped white stone with fluted columns and a flat entabulated roof, the chantry was both impressive and beautiful. And it was dwarfed by the monstrosity behind it. The towering outer wall of the prison complex loomed 50 feet into the horizon. Sandstone, granite, and limestone had been melded seamlessly together with no effort put towards beauty or symmetry, giving the wall a mottled, sickly appearance. For keeping prisoners contained, the outer wall stood comically high, but that was just a side gig for the wall. The main job was not to keep people in, but monsters out. Warmed by the boiling water of the Great Lake of Avernus, the climate of the island did not resemble the barren tundra that surrounded the Great Lake. More than half of the poisonous species of the known world were native to the Arctic jungle of Ixion. Not even elves and ogres considered the land habitable. The incomparable richness of ore beneath the surface was the sole motivation for an imperial colony, such as it was. The Ixion Incarceration and Repentance Complex was nicknamed Golden Island not for what any of the walls or cells were made from, but for the primary export product. Cato should have asked the healer to check for a head injury. If everything went as planned, this very night he would come face to face with that wall and try to find a way over it. Even if he succeeded, his reward was a god's-forsaken jungle that even ogres deemed uninhabitable. And to make matters worse, autumn was settling onto the island. It would not be long before the jungle of the midnight sun became the jungle of the endless night. He definitely should have had his head examined. The approaching guard barely looked at Cato as he reached the chantry and nodded at someone. Cato glanced over his shoulder to see a white-robed acolyte standing on the white stone of the columned portico. He can walk back to the encampment, but then he needs 3 days of rest for the bone to finish healing, the acolyte said. Fine, the guard answered. He had the face of a toad, portly and bald, with wide jowls and several large warts. Without preamble, the toad-faced guard seized Cato by the wrist and started to drag him forward at a brisk pace. Cato limped along, struggling to keep up. The acolyte intoned, "Go with humility and repentance before the Imperator and the goddesses." When they had passed out of the acolyte's earshot, Toadface said, "We expect you to return to work tomorrow." Of course, Cato thought. He knew enough not to answer aloud and instead merely bowed his head to indicate that he had understood his instructions. The blistered handprint on his leg continued to pain him almost as much as the ache from his fused bones as Cato reached the prisoner encampment and was turned loose inside. This night may be my last in this place, one way or another, Cato thought. The encampment was surrounded by 15-foot-high walls of more mottled stone, mostly brown with patches of gray. Inside, hundreds and hundreds of jute fiber tents with wooden poles peppered an enormous field of foot-packed dirt. The grease-stained tents of the camp canteen bustled with activity. Cato seemed to have made it just in time for the midday meal. The line was short by now, composed entirely of emaciated gray hairs. Cato supposed he could have pushed his way to the front of that line without objection, but he was content to take his place at the end and wait. Only one of the old-looking men had blood-red foliage wrapped around his body that rivaled Cato's in size. They might be 40, 50, or 60, but what they would have in common would be that it was 25 or 30 years past the day they had been planted. Cato waited until a squat, bearded man filled his plate with gruel and topped it with a hunk of bread. Greasy stains covered the red and yellow fabric of the man's trousers, but the white apron thrown over his chest was relatively clean. The apron was scant protection for the blood-red leaves that were exquisitely sensitive to temperature, and apt to violently report any injury directly to the nerves of the host. Cato's grip on his plate was unsteady as he limped over to one of the roughly hewn wooden tables at the far end of the canteen. The healing of his leg had left him ravenous, but he continued to stumble forward until he found a table far enough away that he wouldn't look like he was trying to assert any kind of status. When he finally fell onto a bench, he shoved a spoonful of gruel into his mouth as fast as his hand would carry it. It was as if he had rung a dinner bell. An incredibly large man with bright blue eyes, an unruly black beard, and tangled hair that fell to his shoulders strolled over to the table. Sweat ran down the scars on his heavily muscled shoulders and upper arms. He had an olive Midlander complexion close to Cato's own, and was similarly sun-browned from spending half of each day in the fields. The big man hadn't tied his half-shirt in the back, instead leaving it to hang like a placard bearing the number 1188. Wearing the uniform incorrectly was a statement. You can make me wear your jester suit, but it will not humble me. He sat down across from Cato, reached over to Cato's plate, and tore off a hunk of bread with a grin. Cato nodded to him. Despite his hunger, he was happy to continue purchasing the friendship of Marcus Quintus the Squint, giving one of the largest men in the encampment a vested interest in Cato's continued survival. For better or worse, though mostly for the worse, the guards cared little for what happened within the walls of the camp so long as no prisoner left unable to work the next morning. Cato had witnessed arrangements much worse than the deal he had struck with Squint. "Hanging in there, Cato?" Cato was taller than he had been when he had first met the man, but he still had to tilt up his chin to look Squint in the eyes, even when both were seated. "Surviving," Cato answered. "Heard about your little adventure. Wasn't fun." "You don't say." Cato smiled and ate another bite of gruel. Then he said, "You know, I think they let the monsters in here sometimes." Squint snorted. "Why would they do that? Ain't we valuable assets of the Imperium?" "Keeps us afraid," Cato said. "Afraid?" "Of what's waiting for us if we ever make it over the outer wall." Squint laughed. Maybe so," he said, reaching over to dip the bread he had taken into Cato's gruel. Cato did the same. Neither gruel nor bread had much flavor, but the moisture from the gruel made the coarse bread easier to chew. "But you're not afraid," Cato said. He gave the big man a significant look. Squint blinked and looked around. Then he leaned in closer. In a quieter voice, he asked, "Are you saying—" He left the second half of his sentence unsaid. Cato glanced over his shoulder and dropped his voice to a whisper when he was satisfied that none were close enough to hear. "It has to be tonight." Cato, look, if you really can do this thing, you know I want in. But what about the outer wall? It's been climbed before. Once, far as I know. Man had help. One of the guards was his cousin. "I don't have anyone on the inside," Cato admitted. "Septimus only lasted 2 days in the jungle. He came back shouting for help, holding a stump where his left arm used to be. And that was nothing compared to what the guards did to him." "The lesson I take from that is not to let the guards take us alive," Cato said. "7 hells, Cato. You just piss an icicle?" "Hardly," Cato said. "I am afraid. It's just—" Cato looked down at the blood-red leaves covering his chest. "I could feel the roots burrowing deeper when they healed my leg. I don't have much time left." Squint bit his lip and scratched at his black beard. "Maybe you just need some rest," he said. "Always takes time after the healers get at you." "I have the afternoon off," Cato said. "This will be my only chance to work uninterrupted." "Ever think you're just making it worse? Maybe you stop trying to mess with it." Cato just shook his head. "I'm making the attempt today," he said. "And if I succeed, I can't exactly hang around afterwards." "Well, suppose not." Silence hung over the table for a moment. Cato kept eating. "Look," Squint said, "I hear there are monsters in the wilds that make that toad that got you look like a kitten." "You said you wanted to get into the jungle," Cato said. "I mean, better than here, right?" "I mean, yeah, you get this vine off of me and I'm tough enough to take on the tyrant beast." Cato wondered again whether the man was all talk. It was time to find out. "I think I can do it," Cato said. "I think it'll work." "Seen people try. It's a bad way to go." "Better than a slow decline." "Well, maybe." "I can't keep up with my quota for much longer, and then the punishments will make me even weaker." Squint shook his head and sighed. "Malacus, take me. You're too young to be in here." "Listen," Cato said. "I just need to know. If it's tonight, are you in or out?" Squint pulled at his beard and looked up at the sky for a long moment. Fog clung to the horizon, as it always did, steam rising from the boiling lake. The big man's eyes were narrowed against the sun as he just stared, looking vacant. It was the same expression the man had put on when Cato had first approached him. He'd heard Squint complaining about how each prisoner was offered the same ration, regardless of the man's size. Cato had wondered before whether this habit had been how Squint had gotten his quick name. It was an unusual derivation of Marcus Quintus. One usually would have expected something like Mark, or perhaps Marquin. After another moment, Squint turned his beady eyes back to Cato. "You really think you can do this?" "I've been trying to understand how this thing works every day for 5 years, Cato said. "It's gotta be Black Earth magic. Earth in the Pothos aspect, the Devourer." Not too different from what a leech like you can do, as I understand it. What I could do, Squint said. And what you'll be able to do again, Cato said, if I succeed. Squint shook his head in disbelief. Cato, I'm not joking, he said. I don't particularly want to watch them bury you tonight. I don't want them burying me on this god's-forsaken island at all. Everybody who ever pulls out the vine ends up dead. What makes you different? Were the others educated in magical theory? Stop farting out of your mouth. You were 12 when I met you. And I was raised by the Chantry. You and every other orphan in here. Rector Valerius taught acolytes at the Grand Temple of Renova. He intended for all of the children in his care to undergo initiation when we came of age. Cato, the Void Creeper was designed by the Immortal himself. Every spell has a counter, even one designed by the Imperator. I don't understand what you're even going to try. You can't use magic when you're planted. I can't use black magic, Cato said, but I can chant. How's that different? The Void Creeper only eats black magic, void magic, bloodline magic. It only feeds on the mana of the moon and the void. Oh, chanting uses the sun, doesn't it? Exactly. And you really know a chant? I know a few. The secret words, too? Cato frowned. There were no secret words, not as such. But it was true that Cato had no knowledge of the volumes of text describing the techniques of meditation and visualization that were needed to properly perform a white magic chant. But Cato had an ace up his sleeve, a reason to believe he might succeed where others had failed. But it wasn't something he could tell Squint about. No one could be trusted with that secret. I know enough, Cato said, deflecting. Look, I knew a guy once, stranded on a mountain with a broken leg. He tried to... I know the risks, Cato interrupted. If I burn myself from the inside out, at least it will be quick. Squint just shook his head. Trying to heal yourself without any formal training, it's gotta be impossible. This isn't healing, just moving some energy around. Squint sighed. I don't like this, he said. If I don't get this thing out of me soon, I'm dead anyway. I get that, Squint said. He leaned forward and dropped his head onto his chin. The wood of the table groaned beneath the weight. It's just... You're too goddamn young for all this. I've been an adult in the eye of the law for 5 years, Cato said. Don't you try to treat me like a child. Squint nodded, a sober expression on his face. I really think I can pull this off, Cato said. Hope you're right. You'll see, tonight, and when... Cato cut himself off when he saw Squint straighten, eyes on something over Cato's shoulder. They both turned and saw another prisoner approaching. It was that girl with the large mutant ears, the one that King Biro had slapped last night. She wore a wide grin that showed off her canine teeth. Her white hair practically glowed under the sun. A pale, handprint-shaped scar on her neck stood out against the deeply tanned complexion of a Kaladin, the people native to the archipelago at the southernmost reaches of the Imperium. The girl's sharp, pointed ears twitched and swiveled like a cat's as she strode over and confidently swung a leg over the bench to sit behind Cato. Afternoon, gentlemen, she said. Squint looked taken aback. Cato just stared at her. Squint leaned forward. His hands were clenching and unclenching, as if trying to decide whether or not he should punch the girl, just on principle. Even if an insult wasn't intended, a lack of respect wasn't something you wanted anyone to see you tolerating. The gears in Squint's head were still jammed when the girl said, I want in. You want to sit with us? Quint asked, obviously thinking quickly. Look, I know you're new around here, but buzz off. This thing's only been planted in me for a maggot-eaten month, the girl said, pinching a blood-red leaf on her shoulder between her thumb and forefinger. I want it off. So does everybody, Squint said. Now buzz the hell off. He began to crack his knuckles against the surface of the table. The girl just grinned. She removed her fingers from the leaf and pointed at her large, pointed ears. They were almost elf-like in appearance, but longer and more triangular. If Cato had to guess, he would suspect it was a canine mutation. What was odd was that it hadn't been fixed. Chantry surgery wasn't free, but any healer that Cato knew would have humanized those ears for a pittance. Cartilage was far easier to shape than bone. What kind of person would pass that up, enduring the public humiliation of being known to be an ogre blood? Well, perhaps the girl had always worn a hat or a headscarf to hide her ears, and a regular scarf to hide the pale scar on her neck. Prisoners were permitted no fashion accessories, so now she had no choice but to put her ancestry on display. But far from being shy about her ears, this girl was pointing at them with pride. These things aren't just for show, you know, she said. That's why the healer left my ears intact when he fixed my teeth. Squint blinked at the girl in surprise. Cato felt the gears in his head turning. Some kind of political dissident might display her ogre blood heritage with pride, despite the imperial attempts to purge those genes from the population. A political prisoner might be more trustworthy than a criminal with selfish motives, and might have more self-control than someone who had committed a crime of passion. Cato had to learn more. "What kind of chanter cares about something like that?" he asked. "Not a chanter," the girl said casually. "A Yakti healer." Cato blinked at that. "You're part of that cult?" he asked. He had been expecting an anti-king, libertarian, or a blue-faced anarchist, not a part of some fringe religion. The girl snorted derisively. "The mystery of the Seraphim Throw isn't a cult." Cato glanced at Squint, who had one skeptical eyebrow raised. Then he turned back to the girl. "But it's in the name," Cato said. "Cultus Seraphi Yakti." "They aren't all that spiritual, Cato," Squint cut in. "They're organized crime, mostly in the South." "We prefer to say that our businesses live on the exciting edges of the law," the white-haired prisoner said. "They got some legitimate operations, too. Gambling parlors, mostly," Squint said. "Taverns, too?" the girl said. "Yeah, well, if this little thing really is Yakti, I'll eat my spoon," Squint said. "I don't see any holes in her ears or her nose. Yakti are all full of piercings." The girl just shrugged and looked at Cato. "You asked what kind of healer cares about leaving beneficial mutations intact, and I explained. I make it a habit to be honest with my friends." Squint rolled his eyes. "We ain't your friends, girl," he said. The girl's grin didn't waver. Cato found it unnerving. There was nothing genuine in that grin, he was certain. It was a poker face. The girl must have had nerves of steel to grin while antagonizing someone who probably had 200 pounds on her. Normally it was hard to say whether one person could take another in a fight, just by looking. But both this girl and Squint were planted with the Void Creeper. The big man could probably knock her unconscious with both hands cuffed behind his back. "You'll call me a friend once I get us over the walls," the girl said. "Pfft, like you could," Squint said. But the white-haired girl was mainly looking at Cato. "I hear things," she said, pointing to her ears again. "One of the guards at the south wall is always chewing out the man who comes to relieve him. He's always late. The last few nights, the post was left empty at the 5th watch." Squint frowned, clearly trying not to look too impressed. Cato, on the other hand, pressed a finger to his bottom lip in consideration. Squint talked big about his survival skills, but when it came down to it, most of what he said today had been full of hesitation. This girl, on the other hand. "Easily said," Squint scoffed. "Fortunately, I can offer proof." The girl reached into the chest of her half-shirt before passing her hand over Cato's now empty plate. When her hand retreated, 2 small segments of an orange were left behind. Squint snatched up one of the orange pieces and then elbowed Cato, urging him to make the other disappear before anyone saw. Cato popped the fruit into his mouth. It broke into a burst of sour and bitter flavor that made his eyes water. Still, it was better than gruel. And it had been more than a year since Cato had tasted a segment of stolen fruit. "I don't think this thing is ripe," Squint said. "Well, I was in a rush when I picked it last night." "Bit of fruit isn't proof that you can get us out at night," Squint said. But Cato was more than persuaded. If this girl had been outside the encampment at night, she might know things about parts of the prison complex that Cato had never seen. The girl was looking at Cato, studying his face, and apparently pleased at what she could see in his expression. That, too, unnerved him. He hadn't meant to show anything on his face. "We don't know a way off the island," Cato said. "Over the outer wall is enough to start with," the girl answered. "If I don't get this off soon, I'll be dead," Cato said, indicating the thick foliage covering his chest. "And if I do get it off, I can't stick around. I've got no choice but to risk the wilds. The same isn't true for you." The girl's fixed grin broke into a grimace as she glanced down at the red leaves hanging off of her shoulders and clenched her fists. "I want this rotten thing out of me," she whispered. "You said you've only been planted a month," Cato pointed out. "You haven't seen a Sikaran winter yet, when the days are only a few hours long." The girl shook her head and looked at Cato in the eyes. Her emerald gaze was firm. "Better the jungle than this place," she said. "Don't need to think twice." Squint sighed theatrically. "Suppose we can hear this girl out," he said. Squint was asserting his position as decision-maker. Cato noticed what the man was doing, and he was fine with it. If there were 3 of them, one would have to be in charge. Squint was a good choice. A seasoned hunter who had killed monsters and survived in the wilderness before. Even if the Midland wilderness was far less dangerous than the Arctic jungle. "And I'm happy to explain how I can help," the girl said. She stuck out her hand towards Cato. Her wrist, he noted, bore a thin, pale scar in the shape of a finger, matching the large handprint on her neck. Her long fingers would have looked unremarkable if it wasn't for the scar advertising a past surgery. Had they been paws? No, the scar was too small for such an extensive correction. Cato accepted her handshake. Her grip was firm. Looking irritated, Squint shoved his hand nearly the entire way across the table. The girl tried to look unruffled as she shook his hand too, though she winced after feeling the strength of his grip. "I'm Nasafia Dendera," the girl said, "but if you get this vine off of me, you can call me Safi." Cato glanced at Squint, letting him go first. "Marcus Quintus," he said, glaring at the girl. "That should be enough for now." It was Cato's turn. "Catonius Valerius," he said, "but if you get us over the walls, you can call me Cato." Nasafia grinned. "Okay, Catonius, Marcus," she said. "All I really need, apart from this plant out of my flesh, is some rope." Squint frowned, but let the girl talk. As they listened, Cato couldn't decide whether Nasafia's aid would be exactly what they needed, or whether she was a consummate liar who simply wanted him to remove her void creeper so that she could escape on her own, perhaps using Cato and Squint as a convenient distraction. Cato's gut told him that Nasafia was a good liar, and the pain in his mended leg was an all-too-sharp reminder of how little trust he ought to have in the other prisoners. Try to help someone, and she would take advantage of you, if she saw the opportunity. But what choice did he have at this point? Nasafia knew about the plan. Cato stood at the edge of a cliff. He could either jump off and hope to learn to fly on the way down, or wait to be pushed. He kept his doubts to himself until the peal of the bugle called the other prisoners back to work.